The sound of Marcus Chen's shoulder hitting the revolving glass door echoed through the lobby like a gunshot. Not metaphorically, actually echoed. The kind of impact that makes other people wince and look away because they know someone just got hurt and they're relieved it wasn't them. Marcus felt the pain radiate down his arm as the security guard's hands gripped his blazer, twisting the fabric, shoving him toward the exit with the kind of force you use on someone you've already decided isn't human enough to warrant gentleness. The afternoon sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Westbridge Grand Hotel, illuminating the scene in the harsh clarity of 2 p.m. on a Thursday in downtown Boston. Marcus could see his reflection in the glass as he stumbled forward. A 43-year-old black man in an expensive suit being manhandled like a shoplifter, like a threat, like someone who'd done something wrong when all he'd done was check into a hotel room he'd paid for with his own credit card. The security guard, a white man whose name tag read Steve Mitchell, had his hand between Marcus's shoulder blades now, pushing with enough pressure that Marcus had to choose between being shoved to the ground or moving toward the door. He chose to move. Behind them, the front desk manager stood with her arms crossed, her face a careful mask of professional concern that didn't quite hide the satisfaction underneath. And in the corner, partially hidden behind a marble column, someone was recording everything on their phone. If you just felt your stomach drop watching that scene unfold in your mind, if you're already angry about what comes next, then you're in the right place. Hit that like button right now because this story goes somewhere that will make you believe in consequences again. Share this with someone who needs to see what happens when discrimination gets documented and a company learns that some mistakes cost $40 million. Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we tell the stories about justice that actually arrives, about people who refuse to accept being treated as less than human, about the moment when power realizes it picked the wrong target. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to who Marcus Chen really was, because understanding that makes everything that follows hit harder. Marcus Chen was born in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood to a Chinese father and a black mother, which meant he spent his childhood navigating the complicated mathematics of identity in a city that liked its racial categories neat and separate. His mother, Diane, worked 2 jobs to keep them in a small apartment with heat that worked most of the time. His father, Wei, had come to America with an engineering degree that nobody would recognize and ended up managing a restaurant kitchen for 30 years. They raised Marcus to believe in education and hard work with the kind of faith that immigrants and strivers carry. The belief that America's promises were real if you just worked hard enough to claim them. Marcus had absorbed those lessons. He'd put himself through UMass Boston working overnight security jobs, graduated with a degree in computer science, and spent 5 years grinding through code at tech companies that paid just enough to keep him hungry for more. At 29, he'd started his own company, a software firm called Meridian Solutions that specialized in cybersecurity for healthcare providers. The market was exploding, hospitals were getting hacked monthly, patient data was being held for ransom, and Marcus had built an algorithm that could predict and prevent breaches before they happened. The company grew. 10 employees, 50, 200, contracts with major hospital networks across New England, revenue that climbed from thousands to millions to tens of millions over 14 years of 17-hour days and sacrifice weekends and relationships that couldn't survive his dedication to building something that was his. By the time Marcus walked into the Westbridge Grand Hotel on that Thursday afternoon, Meridian Solutions employed 370 people and generated $90 million in annual revenue. He just closed a deal with a hospital consortium that would bring in another $40 million over 3 years. He was in Boston for 2 days of meetings before flying to a cybersecurity conference in San Francisco. He'd booked the Westbridge Grand because it was 4 blocks from his old neighborhood, because he liked the symbolism of staying somewhere expensive in a city that had taught him early that people who looked like him belonged in certain places and not others. The reservation was under his name. The suite was paid for with his corporate American Express card, the black one they give to people who spend enough that the credit limit becomes theoretical. He checked in dozens of times at hotels just like this one across the country. The routine was familiar. Walk to the desk, provide ID and credit card, receive key card, Take elevator to room, shower, change, attend meeting. But the Westbridge Grand's front desk manager, a woman named Carolyn Foster, had looked at Marcus's ID for a long time when he'd presented it. She'd examined the credit card like she was searching for evidence of fraud. She typed on her computer with the slow deliberation of someone running extra verification checks that the system wasn't actually requesting. And when Marcus had politely asked if there was a problem, she'd smiled the smile customer service professionals learn to deploy when they're about to deliver bad news disguised as policy. Mr. Chen, it appears there's been an issue with your reservation. The suite you booked is currently unavailable. We're going to need to verify your information before we can proceed. Marcus had dealt with this before, not often, but enough times that he recognized the script. The sudden unavailability, the additional verification, the subtle implication that something about his presence didn't match the reservation. He'd remained calm. He'd pulled up the confirmation email on his phone and shown her the booking number. He'd offered to call his assistant who'd made the reservation. He'd suggested she contact American Express to verify the card was legitimate. Carolyn had taken his phone, examined the email, and then said something that made the temperature in Marcus's chest spike. Sir, we have the right to refuse service to anyone. I'm going to need you to step away from the desk while I consult with management about whether we can accommodate you. The phrase was surgical, clinical, designed to sound like policy while communicating something else entirely. We don't believe you belong here. We think you're trying to scam us. We're treating you differently because of what you look like. Marcus had felt the familiar calculus running through his mind. He could escalate. He could demand to speak to the general manager. He could make a scene. Or he could stay calm, be polite, give them every opportunity to correct course before things went somewhere nobody wanted. He chose calm. He stepped away from the desk. He sat in one of the lobby's leather chairs and opened his laptop to answer emails while Carolyn consulted with her manager. That's when Steve Mitchell approached him. The security guard had the posture of someone who'd worked law enforcement or military before transitioning to private security. He stood over Marcus's chair with his hands on his belt, his body language broadcasting authority and threat in equal measure. Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification. Marcus looked up from his laptop. I already provided identification to the front desk. I'm a guest waiting for them to resolve an issue with my reservation. Mitchell's expression didn't change. I received a report of someone causing a disturbance in the lobby. I need to verify who you are and why you're here. There had been no disturbance. Marcus had been sitting quietly answering work emails, but he recognized what was happening. Carolyn had called security not to resolve the reservation issue, but to remove him from the property. He was being reclassified from potential guest to problem to be solved. Marcus kept his voice even. I'm not causing any disturbance. I'm sitting in a public hotel lobby waiting to check into a room I've paid for. If the front desk has questions about my reservation, I'm happy to answer them. But I haven't done anything that requires security intervention. Mitchell's hand moved to his radio. Sir, if you don't provide identification immediately and explain your business here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property. Marcus felt the trap closing. If he refused, he'd be removed for non-compliance. If he complied, he'd be validating the premise that his presence required explanation. He chose compliance, pulling out his wallet and handing Mitchell his driver's license. Mitchell examined it for several seconds before handing it back. Mr. Chen, I'm going to need you to exit the building. You can sort out your reservation issues by phone, but you can't remain on the property. That's when Marcus's patience evaporated. I'm not leaving. I have a confirmed reservation and a valid credit card. I haven't violated any hotel policy. If you remove me, you're going to have a serious problem. Mitchell's expression hardened. He reached for his radio and called for backup. Within 90 seconds, a second security guard arrived, then a third. 3 grown men converging on one man sitting in a chair with a laptop, as if he posed some kind of physical threat that required a coordinated response. Marcus stood up slowly, his hands visible, his movements deliberate. He'd lived long enough as a black man in America to know that sudden movements around nervous white men with authority could get you hurt or killed. I'm going to record this interaction, he said clearly, pulling out his phone. That's when Mitchell grabbed his wrist. Not gently, hard enough that the phone fell to the floor. You're trespassing on private property. You need to leave immediately or you'll be arrested. Marcus felt adrenaline flood his system. I'm not trespassing. I'm a paying guest. You're assaulting me. Take your hands off me right now. But Mitchell didn't let go. Instead, he twisted Marcus's arm behind his back and started pushing him toward the revolving doors. Marcus didn't resist physically, but he didn't stop talking. You're making a mistake. I'm a guest. I have a reservation. You're committing assault. Everyone here is watching this. The other two security guards flanked him as Mitchell shoved him across the marble lobby. Other guests stopped and stared. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked satisfied, as if they'd known something was wrong with Marcus's presence and were glad to see it corrected. And in the corner, a college student named Amy Rodriguez held up her phone and captured every second of a successful Black entrepreneur being thrown out of a hotel for the crime of trying to check in while not matching someone's assumption about who deserved to be there. The physical removal took 45 seconds from Mitchell's first grab to Marcus's shoulder, hitting the revolving door to him being shoved onto the sidewalk outside. The impact had torn his blazer at the shoulder seam. His laptop bag had fallen in the lobby and been kicked aside. His phone was still on the floor inside. And Marcus stood on the sidewalk in downtown Boston, breathing hard, his arm throbbing, watching through the glass as Steve Mitchell picked up his phone and laptop bag and set them on the front desk like they were lost property instead of belongings of a man he'd just assaulted. Marcus pulled out his wallet and found a business card for his attorney, a woman named Rebecca Stanton, who'd handled Meridian Solutions corporate contracts for 8 years. He called her from his Apple Watch, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and rage. Rebecca, I need you to do something for me right now. I need you to file a police report and begin documenting everything for a federal civil rights lawsuit. I was just physically removed from a hotel for being Black. Rebecca's voice sharpened immediately. Where are you? Are you hurt? What happened? Marcus told her. The denied reservation, the security confrontation, the physical removal. And as he talked, he watched through the hotel's windows as Carolyn Foster handed his phone and laptop to Mitchell, who was walking them toward the exit. Mitchell pushed through the revolving door and held out Marcus's belongings like he was doing him a favor. Here's your property. You're banned from this hotel permanently. If you come back, you'll be arrested for trespassing. Marcus took his phone and laptop without a word. Then he looked directly at Mitchell and said something he'd learned from 14 years of building a company, of negotiating with people who underestimated him, of surviving in spaces that didn't want him. I want you to remember this moment. Remember my name, Marcus Chen, Meridian Solutions. Remember it because you're going to be hearing it a lot over the next few years. Mitchell laughed, actually laughed. Then he went back inside and returned to his post like nothing significant had happened, like he'd just completed a routine removal of an unwanted person from a property he was paid to protect. He had no idea that the man he'd just assaulted had already called an attorney who specialized in civil rights cases. He had no idea that Amy Rodriguez had uploaded her video to Twitter with the caption, "Black businessman physically removed from Boston hotel for trying to check in," and that the video was getting retweeted every 12 seconds. He had no idea that Marcus Chen's company employed 370 people, including a communications director who was about to turn this incident into a national news story. And he definitely had no idea that the Westbridge Grand Hotel was owned by a publicly traded hospitality corporation that was about to learn what happens when discrimination gets documented and amplified and turned into a lawsuit that discovers patterns instead of isolated incidents. Marcus walked 3 blocks to a Starbucks, sat down at a corner table, and opened his laptop. The first thing he did was email his entire company explaining what had just happened. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was preparing them for the media attention that was coming. Because Marcus understood something that the Westbridge Grand Hotel's management hadn't considered when they allowed Carolyn Foster to deny his reservation and Steve Mitchell to put hands on him. He wasn't just a victim. He was a person with resources, with a platform, with employees who would be outraged on his behalf, with investors and clients and business partners who would demand explanations, with the ability to hire the best attorneys and pay for the kind of sustained legal battle that most discrimination victims couldn't afford. The Westbridge Grand had assumed he was powerless. They were about to learn otherwise. Rebecca Stanton arrived at the Starbucks 20 minutes later, with her junior partner in a legal pad already half filled with notes. She was a white woman in her 50s who'd built her practice representing tech companies and executives in complex litigation. She'd never handled a civil rights case before, but she'd known Marcus for 8 years. She'd watched him build Meridian Solutions from a 20-person startup working out of a converted warehouse to a company that was being courted by private equity firms offering 9-figure buyouts. She liked him. More than that, she respected him. And when she sat down across from him and saw the torn blazer and the expression on his face that mixed fury with exhaustion, she made a decision. I'm going to bring in a co-counsel who specializes in civil rights litigation. Her name is Jordan Hayes. She's won settlements against 3 major hotel chains in the past 5 years for exactly this kind of discrimination. But Marcus, I want you to understand what you're signing up for. This is going to be expensive and time-consuming, and they're going to try to destroy your reputation. They're going to investigate every aspect of your life, looking for anything they can use to discredit you. They're going to drag this out for years, hoping you'll give up. Are you prepared for that? Marcus didn't hesitate. I have 14 years of tax returns showing I built a $90 million company from nothing. I have 370 employees who can testify to my character. I have 0 criminal record and a credit score over 800. But more than that, I have a video of me being physically assaulted by hotel security for trying to check into a room I paid for. So yes, I'm prepared. Because this isn't just about me. It's about every Black person who's been treated like they don't belong in spaces they've earned the right to occupy. Jordan Hayes joined the case within 48 hours. She was a Black woman who'd graduated from Howard Law and spent 15 years building a practice around Title II of the Civil Rights Act, the section that prohibited discrimination in public accommodations. She'd won cases against restaurants that seated Black customers near bathrooms and kitchens, against retail stores that followed Black shoppers with security, against hotels that suddenly had no vacancies when Black guests tried to book rooms. She knew the patterns, the coded language, the way discrimination in 2023 rarely announced itself with slurs and signs, but hid behind policy and procedure and the phrase, "I'm just doing my job." She watched Amy Rodriguez's video 11 times, making notes about each violation, the unequal treatment at the front desk, the escalation to security without cause, the physical force used to remove someone who was sitting quietly in a chair, the fact that Mitchell had confiscated Marcus's phone to prevent him from recording. Each action was a potential violation of Massachusetts public accommodation laws and federal civil rights statutes. But Jordan knew that proving discrimination required more than one incident. You had to show pattern and practice. You had to demonstrate that this wasn't an isolated mistake, but systemic behavior. So she started digging. She filed public records requests for every police call to the Westbridge Grand over the past 3 years. She posted in online forums asking if anyone had experienced similar treatment at the hotel. She hired investigators to interview former employees. And what she found made the case transform from a single incident into something much larger. Over the past 3 years, the Westbridge Grand had called police or security to remove guests from the property 47 times. 41 of those guests were Black, Latino, or Asian. 6 were white, and all 6 of those incidents involved actual criminal activity like drug possession or physical altercations. The pattern was undeniable and damning. Jordan also discovered that Steve Mitchell had a history. Before working at the Westbridge Grand, he'd been a police officer in a Boston suburb for 12 years. He'd left the force after an internal investigation into excessive force complaints. 4 different people, all minorities, had accused him of unnecessary violence during the routine stops. The department had cleared him each time, but the pattern had been enough that his union rep had suggested he might want to consider a career change to avoid further scrutiny. The Westbridge Grand had hired him without asking about those complaints. They'd put him in a position of authority over guests without adequate training on discrimination or de-escalation. And when he'd assaulted Marcus, they'd backed his version of events without question. The hotel's incident report, which Jordan obtained through discovery, described Marcus as aggressive and uncooperative, claiming he had refused to leave when asked and had become physically threatening towards staff. None of that was visible in the video. None of that matched witness statements from other guests in the lobby. It was simply the story the hotel had decided to tell to justify what had happened. But stories only work when there's no evidence to contradict them. And Amy Rodriguez's video had given Jordan everything she needed to prove the hotel was lying. The lawsuit was filed in federal court 6 weeks after the incident. Marcus Chen versus Westbridge Grand Hotel and Westbridge International Hospitality Corporation. The complaint laid out 17 separate violations of federal and state civil rights laws. It detailed the discriminatory removal. It presented the statistical evidence of racial disparity in security responses. It documented Mitchell's history. And it asked for damages, compensatory damages for the physical and emotional harm Marcus had suffered, punitive damages to punish the hotel for reckless disregard of civil rights, and injunctive relief requiring the hotel to implement new policies and training to prevent future discrimination. The hotel's initial response was exactly what Jordan had expected: denial. They claimed Marcus had been removed for legitimate security concerns, not because of his race. They claimed he'd been disruptive and had refused reasonable requests. They pointed out that the Westbridge Grand served thousands of minority guests without incident, implying that Marcus must have done something to trigger the response. Their lawyers filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the complaint failed to state a valid claim. The motion was denied. Then they tried another tactic. They offered to settle for $50,000 and an agreement that Marcus wouldn't talk about the incident publicly. Jordan had brought the offer to Marcus with barely concealed contempt. "They're trying to buy your silence for the cost of a mid-level employee's salary. They think you'll take the money and go away quietly. What do you want to do?" Marcus had looked at the settlement offer for approximately 5 seconds before sliding it back across the table. "Tell them no. Tell them I want a public trial, a jury verdict, and enough money that every hotel chain in America hears about what it costs when you discriminate." So they went to trial. The discovery process took 18 months. Jordan's team subpoenaed employment records, training materials, guest complaint files, and internal communications. What emerged was a picture of a company that talked about diversity in its marketing materials, but practiced discrimination in its daily operations. They found emails from Carolyn Foster to other front desk managers discussing strategies for maintaining clientele standards and managing urban guests. They found training materials that instructed security to be extra vigilant with guests who seemed out of place in upscale environments. They found performance reviews praising Steve Mitchell for his proactive approach to security threats after he'd removed numerous guests who turned out to have valid reservations and credit cards. All black, all treated as suspicious until proven otherwise. The trial began on a Monday morning in federal court. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Jordan put Amy Rodriguez on the stand to describe what she'd witnessed. She played the video for the jury 14 times from different angles, walking them through each moment where Marcus had tried to de-escalate while hotel staff escalated. She brought in expert witnesses on implicit bias who explained how assumptions about race could lead well-meaning people to treat identical behavior differently depending on the race of the person exhibiting it. She presented the statistical evidence showing that the Westbridge Grand security responses were racially skewed to a degree that couldn't be explained by chance. And she put Marcus on the stand to tell his story. He described growing up in Roxbury, building his company, the pride he'd felt booking a suite at an upscale hotel in his hometown, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in a lobby full of strangers, the physical pain of being grabbed and shoved, the professional impact of having a video of his removal circulate online, with some clients questioning whether they wanted to do business with someone involved in a controversy. He was calm and articulate and believable. The defense tried to rattle him during cross-examination, suggesting he'd been confrontational with Carolyn Foster, implying he'd moved aggressively toward Steve Mitchell, questioning why he'd refused to simply leave and resolve the issue later. Marcus had looked at the defense attorney with the same steady gaze he'd used in hundreds of business negotiations. "I refused to leave because I had done nothing wrong. I refused to leave because I knew if I complied with an illegal order, it would be used as evidence that the order was justified. I refused to leave because I'm tired of being asked to accommodate other people's racism by making myself smaller and quieter and less present. I had every right to be in that lobby, and I'll be damned if I'm going to apologize for insisting on being treated with basic human dignity. The defense's case was weaker than they'd hoped. They put Carolyn Foster on the stand to explain that she'd had legitimate concerns about the reservation. But under Jordan's cross-examination, she couldn't articulate what those concerns were beyond a vague sense that something seemed off. They put Steve Mitchell on the stand to describe Marcus as threatening, but the video showed a man sitting in a chair with his hands on a laptop. They brought in hospitality experts to testify that hotels had broad discretion to remove guests for security reasons, but those experts fell apart when asked to explain why the Westbridge Grand security removals were 90% minority guests. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, they found for Marcus on every count. They awarded him $2 million in compensatory damages for physical and emotional harm. And then they awarded him $38 million in punitive damages, sending a message that discrimination at this scale, backed by this level of corporate indifference, required consequences severe enough to change behavior. The total judgment of $40 million was one of the largest civil rights settlements in Massachusetts history. Westbridge International Hospitality Corporation's stock dropped 11% the day the verdict was announced. But the money was only part of the story. The judge also ordered injunctive relief. The Westbridge Grand and every other Westbridge property nationwide had to implement new anti-discrimination training. They had to create an independent complaint system for guests who believed they'd been treated unfairly. They had to collect and report data on security responses broken down by guest demographics. And they had to submit to federal monitoring for 5 years to ensure compliance. The hotel industry was watching. Within 6 months, 4 other major chains had voluntarily implemented similar policies, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because their lawyers had done the math on what a similar lawsuit would cost. Marcus Chen didn't keep the $40 million. After attorney fees and taxes, he was left with about $22 million. He put $5 million into a foundation dedicated to fighting discrimination in public accommodations, funding lawyers who could represent victims who didn't have his resources. He donated another $5 million to organizations working on implicit bias training and criminal justice reform. He used $2 million to create a scholarship fund for minority students studying hospitality management, hoping that changing who ran these hotels might change how they operated. The rest he split between his employees as bonuses, believing that the people who'd built Meridian Solutions with him deserved a share in the vindication. He gave interviews carefully and selectively, always making the same point. This wasn't about one hotel or one security guard. This was about systems that allowed discrimination to flourish as long as it stayed quiet and deniable. Steve Mitchell was fired 3 days after the verdict. He filed for bankruptcy 6 months later when Marcus's attorneys went after his personal assets. Carolyn Foster was reassigned to a back office position where she never interacted with guests again. The general manager who'd backed their version of events was let go in a corporate restructuring